From advertising to software as a service to data.
Across all of our programs and clients, we've seen a 55 to 65% open rate.
Getting brands authentically integrated into content performs better than TV advertising.
Typical lifespan of an article is about 24 to 36 hours.
If we're reaching out to the right person with the right message and a clear call to action, then it's just a matter of timing.
Welcome to the MarTech Podcast, and I Hear Everything production. In this podcast, you'll hear the stories of world-class marketers that use technology to drive business results and achieve career success. We'll unearth the real-world experiences of some of the brightest minds in the marketing and technology space so you can learn the tools, tips, and tricks they've learned along the way. Now here's the host of the MarTech Podcast, Benjamin Shapiro.
Welcome to the MarTech Podcast. I'm your host, Benjamin Shapiro, and today we're going to discuss podcast secrets that you need to know. Joining us is Todd Cochrane, who's the CEO of Blubrry Podcasting, which is a full-service hosting provider with over 100,000 podcasts in their umbrella. Yesterday, Todd and I talked about his podcast growth secrets, and today we're going to continue the conversation talking about business podcasting strategies. All right, here's the second part of my conversation with Todd Cochrane, the CEO of Blubrry Podcasting. Todd, welcome back to the MarTech Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Excited to have you back on the show and to continue our conversation. You know, yesterday we talked about audience growth, some of the ways that you can start a podcast, build your audience, and a lot of that has to do with leveraging the assets and the knowledge that you have about your existing audience. I know who my customers are. I have relationships with some of them. I'm going to present them with the option to listen to my podcast, and then I'm going to go find other places where they hang out, and I'm going to put my podcast there to start growing my audience. So wonderful. We consistently publish content. People are starting to listen. They're following our show. We're getting impressions. We've got a valuable podcast, but it's not that simple. You actually have to derive value out of the podcast. So let's talk a little bit about the B2B side of podcasting and what businesses are doing to make their podcast a valuable asset. Once you've grown your audience, how do you extract value out of the content you're producing?
It really boils down to, again, that value you're going to deliver to the audience and what you expect from it. In every case scenario is different. If you are a lawyer, obviously, you're going to be talking about your firm, what you're doing, maybe a quick overview, some of the cases that you're running, some of the experience you've had, past successes. And really, the ultimate goal is, what is that call to action? And every show is going to be a little bit different. But again, it goes back to the goal. So we talked about originally is the goal, again, for leads, is the goal for someone to walk in the door. Oftentimes, businesses will get discouraged because they say, well, I'm not getting a lot of value out of this podcast. But I often find is I'll ask them, how's the results been? And they say, well, we don't know how the results of the podcast have been. And I say, how come? Because oftentimes businesses will not even ask a new client, how did you hear about me? They just go into the sales. It's mind-boggling to me that you would spend money on marketing and doing a podcast, doing the other social components that you're probably already active in, and then not ask the client that's walked in the door, how did you hear about us? There was a reference, was it a newspaper ad, whatever it was. And I hear this a lot, and it kind of shocks me. Also, at the same time, there isn't a lot of records being kept by businesses on the actual value of the new customer. If the customer comes in and you've derived that they have found you because of the podcast, is that listener $1 million client or are they a $100,000 client? So what is the value of the client that you're getting from the content or maybe the overall ecosphere? So I think it's really important that you not only know what the goal is, but you measure your ROI on the backside to see what kind of results you're getting.
There's a couple different things that go into the podcast attribution problem. And I guess it depends what your approach is and the reason, which department in your marketing team your podcast lives in. When I worked at eBay a million years ago, there was a brand department and there was a performance marketing department. Brand was awareness. All we're doing is looking at, are people aware of our products, our services? We're doing surveys, trying to understand unaided brand awareness. Do just people know who we are? Podcasting is incredible for that. But awareness isn't necessarily a business driver in the short term, right? Awareness over time lowers your cost per acquisition. The more people are aware, the more thought leadership, the more comfortable, the more likely to buy, the more likely to make a larger investment. But that's really hard to track. How are brands actually associating the value that they get from the podcast from a direct response perspective? You mentioned, well, you got to figure out who your customer is. Is it all post-purchase surveys, or what are some of the tools and solutions that businesses can use to try to figure out what the true impact on their business is from podcasting?
If you're a digital business and you are doing online sales, and that's relatively easy. It's a promo code, a direct landing page that you're sending them to that's maybe off the beaten path. Maybe it's yourcompany.com/podcast. Maybe where you're doing marketing on Facebook, it's yourcompany.com/Facebook, basically where you're directing the folks that are getting exposure to your business, where you're sending them to in that measurement. Promo code utilization has been used since the beginning of time, obviously, to measure. There's obviously the ability then, if it's a brick and mortar, when people are coming in, again, simply asking how you found out about the business or the referral. Again, I think it's all in that call to action and how you're going to determine where that customer came from. It can be complicated because sometimes it could be a referral from someone that listened to the podcast too. So I think you have to take in all those scenarios, because I'll oftentimes hear about something and I'll have a friend, they're looking for something. So I heard about this business over here on this particular show. Why don't you go check this company out? So when they talk to him, they're like, well, I heard about you from Todd. Well, who's Todd? Well, Todd listened to your podcast. Well, then that gives you an idea. It was an indirect referral. But again, I think it's really about asking that new client, if you have that face-to-face, where it's come from. There's obviously attribution tools you can use as well, just to see if someone's landed on your page. A lot of content creators are not using that particular service because it can add costs to a podcast. But it is one way to definitely measure to see that if someone has actually listened, if they've actually come to your website.
What I'm hearing from you is really three types of podcast attribution. You mentioned the technology solution. There's attribution tools. I know Veritonic, Pod Sites. There's a couple other tools that are basically taking your IP address, trying to match it to a household, giving you a pixel to put on your website, and then they're matching back to that household as well. I think it's an imperfect science. It can be directionally interesting. Promo codes. Not everybody that hears your podcast that buys something is going to use a promo code. So again, you're taking a haircut on the value the content is creating. And then you're talking about your post-purchase survey, which is, hey, how'd you hear about us? I think that there's a fourth option here, and something that's kind of underutilized, something that we've been doing with our podcast for a while, but retargeting the people that are listening to your podcasts with ads as well. Hey, you heard this offer on our show. We're going to put it in front of you in LinkedIn or on Facebook. And that way, when you're walking on the treadmill or doing the dishes, listening to a podcast, you don't have the ability to click on something. If that offer shows up in front of you in a digital advertising format, then there's a click and then you can actually determine the ROI. I think that, to me, is the future of podcast attribution. There's also different goals for what people are doing podcasts for. We talked about this a little yesterday, where it's building awareness. It can be lead generation. Are there other reasons why businesses are using podcasting? What are their strategies for not only publishing the content, but also deriving value other than just direct purchases?
I think what we saw during COVID was that a lot of businesses who had not been doing podcasts added podcasts to their lineup. And it was largely because they were doing everything else. But podcast just was a missing piece of their overall marketing strategy. So I think in today's business world, the way things work, I think it's imperative that every business has a podcast. I think it just goes along with the overall marketing strategy. There's a lot of companies out there that are resistant to doing content or doing a branded podcast. So I think more importantly than anything else is just the consideration to do a show if you're not doing one. But again, you don't want to be putting together an infomercial. You want to put together something that's beneficial, has value, and that your listeners will derive value for and appreciate you, and then come back and reward you with their business.
It's that value, it's that thought leadership that is a little bit what I'm digging for here. Is you can think of your podcast to be a way to build awareness. You can think of your podcast as a way to generate leads, drive people into your funnel. But often it is building credibility, right? It is having people not only know you, but listen to you and understand that you are an expert in your field. And that credibility then pays dividends down the road. Todd, are there any other business podcasting strategies that you can think of that we should chat about?
Well, I think you struck on one thing that's important. Oftentimes, we buy from people we like and people we trust. And how that usually arrives is through an introduction personally, or could be through a podcast, because we're pretty good judges of character. I always tell content creators, if you're going to talk about something that you can't fully get behind, be careful, because people can smell that and literally hear it in your voice. So if you are yourself and you are genuine, that'll resonate through the content and do as much marketing value for you as anything else. Because you're right. People want to work with people that they like and trust. And I think podcasts have the ability for those that are putting out great content to become a leader in their community or wherever they may be and drive that trust that's going to end up having you result in a new client.
It's not just awareness. It's not just lead generation. It's credibility as well. That's one of the key components to leveraging a podcast for your business. And that wraps up this episode of the MarTech Podcast. Thanks for listening to my conversation with Todd Cochrane, the CEO of Blubrry Podcasting. Join us again tomorrow when Todd and I wrap up our conversation talking about podcast advertising best practices. If you can't wait till our next episode and you'd like to learn more about Todd, you can find a link to his LinkedIn profile in our show notes. You can contact him on Twitter. His handle is Geek News. That's GeekNews. Or you could visit his company's website, which is blubrry.com, BLUBRRY.com. Just one more link in our show notes I'd like to tell you about. If you didn't have a chance to take notes while you were listening to this podcast, head over to martechpod.com, where we have summaries of all of our episodes and contact information for our guests. You can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter, and you can even send us your topic suggestions or your marketing questions, which we'll answer live on our show. Of course, you can always reach out on social media. Our handle is MarTechPod, MarTechPod, on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, or you can contact me directly. My handle is Ben J. Shap, BenJShap. And if you haven't subscribed yet and you want a daily stream of marketing and technology knowledge in your podcast feed, we're going to publish an episode every day this year. So hit the subscribe button in your podcast app, and we'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning. All right, that's it for today. But until next time, my advice is to just focus on keeping your customers happy.